Was considerably better than a lot of other companies that I've been to.
Definitely will be able to apply what I've used here right away.
I mean, I feel like I refreshed my knowledge of Spring a lot.
It was excellent. It was unlike anything I've had before. I'd probably say it was even better than some of my college courses.
This is very informative, just giving, this is what we're going to get into in the course, this is what we're going through, this is
sort of fun too, like it's not a very, like stiff lecture format, so it's, it's been a really good experience.
The information is delivered very well. It's timed just right. The integration of the lecture with the labs helps out a lot, being able to apply what you just have learned.
Andrew was definitely very knowledgeable about the subject matter. He was able to distill quite complicated concepts down into very simple terms that most people could understand.
Sure, clearly knows what he's doing, so that's good. It's like he's done this before, so that he's just reading out of a teacher's guide book. It's that he's done this before, and if you have any questions, he will answer, or he'll find an answer soon. That's nice.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to be talking to you over the next hour about the iOS 5 new SDK features. And I should just say right now that this is definitely a presentation for those who already have experience working with iOS. If you don't have previous experience, that doesn't mean you should log out. Please stay with me. This will give you a nice overview of the different features that have been improved and added to iOS 5. So you'll definitely get some value out of it, but I will mention that if you'd like to learn some of the basics of iOS, which I will be more or less glossing over during this presentation, we're expecting that you have that background, that I will be teaching my next complete iPhone class at Intertech, and that will be the week of December 12th is our next offering. Typically I offer that about once every other month here at Intertech, and so you can find out more information about that class at intertech.com. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jason Shapiro. You see my email address there. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to take any questions that you might have been posting during the presentation and answer as many as I can. If we run out of time, what I'll do is I will take the rest of the questions and write up some sort of a blog entry at intertech.com/blog and post some answers to other questions that were brought up during the presentation. However, if you have any other kind of questions, feel free to email me at the address that you're seeing there. I've been an instructor and consultant for Intertech for 3.5 years now, primarily focusing on Java, iOS, and web development. Prior to joining Intertech, I've had about 17 years of professional software development and architecture experience. Most of those years were working on Java-based portals, business intelligence applications using web services to connect disparate tiers and architectures. I hold a Master of Science in Software Engineering, and many, many years ago, over 10 years ago now, I completed the Sun Certified Java Programmer and the Web Component Developer certificates. So let's talk about iOS, a little more interesting than me. Today we're going to start by introducing the iOS 5 SDK, so where you get it and what you need and what devices are supported. And then we're going to focus on 3 primary improvements and additions to iOS 5. So Storyboards, and that's probably where I'll spend most of my time during this presentation. I think this is one of the most fantastic additions to iOS 5, and hopefully once you see the time it's going to save you to code and sort of the coherence it's going to bring to designing your applications, I think you'll agree with me. After we look at Storyboards, we'll take a look at automatic reference counting. So that's also known as ARC. You'll hear it known as, referred to it in both ways. So ARC is designed to remove the burden that's been placed on developers of handling memory management. Now, I think it'd be a mistake to say that it removes, that we no longer have to worry about memory management. Just as you do with languages that have garbage collection, it's still very possible to write code that's not efficient in dealing with memory. But what automatic reference counting is going to give us is the ability to stop worrying about all those retains and releases and dealloc methods and things like that. So let's briefly look at automatic reference counting. And then we'll also shift over to looking at the iCloud. Now, the iCloud, persisting app data with the iCloud is a really big topic. Too big to cover in just a section of this presentation. But I do want to kind of go over some of the features. I'll show you a code example of how you're able to do key value storage in the iCloud. But if you are in the Twin Cities area, I'd like to encourage you to attend the Twin City iPhone Developer Group meeting on December 6th. And you can find out more information about that at www.tcidev.net. And that is on December 6th, we'll be giving a presentation on just that topic, so going into more details with iCloud. So other than that, we'll look at just a couple of other features that I want to point out that are available, and then we'll shift to a Q&A. So starting with the iOS 5 SDK, this was one of the longer beta periods that we had with a new release of iOS. It was about 4 months from when the first beta was released on June 6th to the time we finally had a public release on October 12th. 2011. And iOS 5, of course, is now available for most modern devices of iOS, so that includes for the iPhone 3GS, 4, and 4S. We have it's available for both the iPad and iPad 2, and for the iPod Touch, the 3rd and 4th generation. And lots of new great development features. Storyboards, as I mentioned, this is probably my favorite new feature, and that's what we'll go over coming up here next. iCloud storage I mentioned, but there's also a lot of new APIs that I won't be covering in this class, but I want you to be aware of. Core Image, which is some new stuff to be affecting graphical images, which is very, very cool, really worth looking into. There's the Twitter API. With iOS 5, it's really easy now to take information from other applications and send it right to your Twitter feed. iMessage is a SMS, I don't want to say replacement, but it's an SMS replacement. It's the ability that we are now able to send text messages to people with other iPhone 5 devices without having to go through a phone company's SMS messaging. So that's great on a user level, right? So save a little bit of money. But of course, there's also an API that's available for us developers so that we can connect to that as well. All right, so what do you need to have the iOS 5 SDK? At a very bare minimum, what you're going to need is Xcode 4.2 and the other APIs that are included in iOS 5 SDK. Now, both of those things are included as a single download. For upgrading your device, that's pretty easy now. You can just plug your device into iTunes. Make sure you download the latest iTunes. 10.5, I believe, is the current version. And when you synchronize your device and upgrade it, you'll have iOS 5. So not a whole lot of issues anymore for downloading that compared to when we were dealing with the beta. How do you download the iOS 5 SDK? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to log into your developer account. And when you get to the developerapple.com website with the URL that I'm showing right here, that I've got, there's 2 links really. The main is the Xcode download if you've installed Lion. So if you don't have Lion, then you're going to want to click on the little download text link that I'm pointing to, and that's if you have Snow Leopard. So definitely make sure you choose the right version of the SDK. All right, so with that said, let's jump right into our topic of storyboards. So if you think about storyboards outside of the iOS world, if we think about storyboards that are used when you're working on a movie, or if you're working on any kind of advertisement, or you're trying to design some sort of a screen flow, what you have are a bunch of scenes, and the scene just sort of describes the most important aspect of what's going to be shown at a given time. And then there are transitions, segues between those scenes. And so that paradigm was carried over into iOS through this use of storyboards. And so the purpose is really just to get a cohesive view of your entire interface for your application, including its transitions. So what you're seeing on your screen right now are 3 different scenes. And you're seeing the segues. Those are the arrows between them. You'll notice there's an arrow to the left of where it says navigation controller, and it's not really connected to anything. Well, that tells me this is the first scene that's going to happen when the application starts. And then I can see the transitions to other scenes. Now, this is a typical simple master detail flow, where we've got a navigation controller underneath. The navigation controller has a table view. We'll talk more about that coming up. And then when the cell is clicked on for that table view, it goes over to a detail view. So a pretty typical set of screens that you would see in an iOS application. But what's obviously really nice about this storyboard is that we're not jumping from nib to nib to nib to try to get a hold of this whole picture. We're able to see all the screens at once right on the same storyboard. So the benefits, I think, just even from looking at that one single picture are pretty obvious. We now have a really good picture of the application's transitional flow. So the way you think about this is that it's really just having a single place to view all your nibs. Now, I want to say that it's similar to, it's not the same thing. We're not really using nibs anymore, so we are using storyboard. These are going to be different controls that we're dropping in. You're not going to be creating nib files, although strictly speaking, you could. I mean, if you want to have an application that is a storyboard and use some nibs, there's nothing really stopping you from doing that. We can still programmatically make a nib and call it programmatically. But I think what you'll find is that working with storyboards by itself really provides the maximum amount of benefit. The other thing that I'm going to be showing you, with my first 2 examples anyway, I'm going to go back to an older version of Xcode and show how we would make something with a nib, and then jump to our newer version with the storyboard. I'll only do that once or twice here in the presentation. You'll get the feel pretty quickly. But I do want to make it clear that you're going to be writing a lot less code than you used to. There's a lot more true WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get type activity happening with interface builder. And so we're going to be able to drag and drop transitions instead of jumping into our code and creating manually, pushing controllers onto say a UI navigation control. Now, of course, nothing's stopping you, right? This is something we've always had with iOS, is that we can decide we can decide how much of this we want to do in the interface builder and how much we want to do programmatically. Nothing has changed there. You still have that flexibility. But if you decide to go, the route with storyboards as much as possible, I think you're going to see, again, a lot less code. There's also some, new functionality. There's some new objects that you can drag and drop, but there's also just some new things that we can do, such as creating a static table design. And I will show you an example of that coming up. Also, there's some flexibility here as well. Storyboards can be dynamically loaded at runtime. So here are the different components that we have available to us. I want to start at the lower right corner where you see main storyboard.storyboard. So once I've created a project, and what you're seeing here is like a snippet of our Xcode, you're looking at the navigation section, the organizer. And so, of course, we've got our app delegates and our view controllers. But now, instead of having a nib file, we've got something here called main storyboard.storyboard. And over to the right, we've got a graph that's available. And so that's where we're going to be dragging and dropping and looking at all the different components that we have. So we have our main storyboard. On the left side, we've got a scene. So in a storyboard, you have a bunch of scenes that are connected to each other via some sort of a segue, some sort of a transition. So a scene really is a view controller. The way to think of a scene is that it's a single view that you will see on your screen. That's the easiest way to think about it. And the segue is simply the transition. It's going to hook up different transitions and give you, options of what that transition should do.
So when you first start and you create a brand new project, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of new templates. At first, you're going to think, where did everything go? Where's my navigation application? Things that they're used to have been working with before. They're all still there. They're just kind of packaged a little bit differently. And so, for example, we've got our master detail application, which is very similar to what we had before with our navigations, where you create a table. It goes a little bit farther. Now we have not only a navigation controller, but we have a table view controller, and we also then have a detail view controller, which is something we would typically be adding. Anyway, in our application. So that's really nice. I'd just say, like, as a general theme, I found that the templates that they provided for the projects feel a little bit more like what we really do when we're coding. There's still, of course, some very simple ones. If you're the type of person that likes to do a lot more, less drag and drop and a lot more programming, or even just, even if you are dragging and dropping, having the ability to have a much more control over it, less things auto-generate for you. You still have things like the single view application and the empty application that you see here. So once you've actually selected a project, in this case, let's pretend I selected the master detail, you'll notice that we have a class prefix. And so with the Objective-C, there's no name spacing. So if I have a class called customer and you have a class called customer, and I'm using your library inside of my code, we're going to have a problem. There's going to be a collision with the name of the classes. So we need to make sure our class names are unique for the entire project. So the way that we do that typically is we add some sort of a prefix. Of course, everyone's used to NS, which is used for all of the next step classes that we use, NS string and NS mutable array and things like that. So here you can see I just put intertech in front of it. And what's nice is, just again, a little handy, save you a little bit of time type of feature where whenever I create a brand new class, it's going to put intertech in front of it. You'll also notice that I've got an arrow pointing to a checkbox that you'll want to make sure is checked, and that's where we use a storyboard. So I have created the project now, and we're looking at basically Xcode. On the left side, we have our navigation. And with the navigation, we have a little entry in there called main storyboard.storyboard. So that's going to be where you're going to do all your work. Remember, the idea here is that this is going to be the bulk of your application. In fact, everything that I've been doing so far in sort of my R&D and lightweight testing of storyboard, I've done everything with a single storyboard. So coming from a paradigm where we would have lots and lots of nibs and you never really see the full picture, this has been terrific. You'll notice on the left side that we've got an arrow that's pointing to the navigation controller. And so that arrow isn't connected to anything. That tells me this is the first screen. When I start up my application, this is what's going to be launched. Now, compare and contrast that to having to go into your app delegate and see, okay, which window has been, what's been set as the root controller for a window, things like that. None of this is hard. I mean, none of the stuff that we did before was really awful. I mean, I thought the nibs were great. I thought programming in Objective-C was great. The relationship between UI application and our delegates and whatnot, all that made, great sense. But I think this is just nice. I can quickly look at my storyboard. I not only see all the transitions, I not only see what all the different scenes of my application, but I'm also able to see things like, all right, and what's the first scene? It's all visual to me now. If you click on the target inside of Xcode for your project, you'll notice that there's a new entry in the iPhone iPod deployment info, and that's the main storyboard. So that's going to be programmatically how UI application figures out, all right, what am I supposed to load first? Before, in earlier versions of Xcode, all we had was main interface. And of course, that would be your main window.nib. You still can do that. So, I mean, if I don't want to use main storyboard, I can change that main interface to whatever I want. And of course, this summary screen really is nothing more than a nice GUI end to our plist file, which dictates how our apps are going to run. All right, so with our scene, this is how you actually drag one in. We go to our view controllers in our objects, list of objects, and you just drag it right onto the storyboard, just as you would have done, you know, if you were going to add a view controller to a nib file. But once you do that, when you drag the table view controller, it's going to create this big screen that you see here. It's got your, in this case, we're doing a table view controller. Below that, you'll see a little box, a little rectangle. That's just a shorthand with icons to tell you what objects are, you know, inside of this particular controller, which are connected. So if you think about the nib file, we used to be able to see all of the different objects that are inside of there. This is the same thing. One of those is, you know, first responder. The other is, you know, somebody, whatever else we have added to our particular scene. Another thing that's really nice, I'm sure all of us have run into this before, that where we have a, we've got our table view, or we've got some sort of view, and we just think, oh, you know what, I really want to add something before this, and a lot of times it's like a navigation controller or something. So, and it's easy to do with a nib, you know, you just go in, you rearrange some stuff, change some controllers, go into the code, make sure your outlet's pointing to the right controller now, and get everything set up. But with our storyboards, when you make those kind of decisions, if I want to add, you know, I've got some sort of a screen, and I want to add it to either a navigation controller or a tab view controller, all I have to do is now go into the editor menu. There's an option called Embed In, and from there I can select which one I'd want to embed. So what had happened before I selected navigation controller, all that was on the storyboard right there was the table view controller. I select navigation controller and it puts it right in front. And also, you can see it sets it as the initial scene that's loaded. So I didn't have to go back and reconnect anything up. Extremely slick. So in between our different scenes, we're going to want to you know, have some sort of a segue. We want to move from one scene to another. And what you do is you find some sort of control from the scene that, you know, like either a table cell or a button, and you hold the control key down, put your mouse on the source action thrower, I would say, and drag that over to the scene you want to move to. And when you do that, it'll give you some options. It might say that, you know, do we want to call a method here, perform segue with identifier? Talk about that in a minute. If you're just moving like in a modal view, which I'll show you in a second, you'll be able to move from, you'll just be able to select that I want to move to a different view controller. In fact, that's what I'm going to show you as our first demo here. I'm going to create a modal view. So very, very simple. I've got one view controller that has a button called Click Me, and when I click it, it'll move to a different view and say Success. So essentially, click the button, move over, and say Success as a modal view. So what I'm going to do first, and I know that because of the audio trouble, we're running a little bit out of time. I hope everyone will be okay with staying maybe just a little bit longer for the presentation, but this will be the only one where I kind of go back and forth to old Xcode to new Xcode. But I just want to show you at least one sort of before and after so you get a sense. So here I've got, this is the old Xcode. When I say old, it's not that old, but you know, the previous version of Xcode. And so I'm just going to make a view-based application. And this is just going to be, you know, a button test. All right, so now I've got this, and you can see here's that main interface that lists that main window nib will be first. I've got a nib here that's just a regular view. So let's design this real quick. I'm just going to grab this view for my button test, and I'm just going to change the color so that we can see the modal window change a little bit easier. All right, so I changed that background to be red, and I'll just drag and drop a button, and let's just call the button Push Me. All right, so now I've got that. Let's add a brand new view controller. So I'll create a new file. I create a new UI view controller subclass, which will just be a regular view controller. And of course, I want a nib for that. And we'll just call this Success View Controller. All right, let's look at that nib. And again, I'm going to just change the color that we've got just to something else. And we'll put a little message here that says success. All right, so far pretty easy, right? I mean, even with our previous version of Xcode, we had it pretty easy. We're not jumping into XML files and, you know, trying to design our UIs that way. We just did a lot of dragging and dropping. It's really now that I want to connect these two nibs together that we start to see, I wouldn't say a limitation, but where we've improved with the new Xcode. So, you know, now that I want to link these two together, first of all, I'm not able to see both of them at the same time. But what I'll first do is I'll go into this nib, and I need to connect this button to some code. So we've got this nice feature, of course, of our editor so that I'm able to click on the button, and I can right-click on it. I can decide that I'm going to do a touch-up on the inside and jump this into my code. Call this the button was pressed. A little bit verbose, wasn't it? All right, so I have the button was pressed, and it created the interface code for me automatically. And if I go back now, let's grab our menu. Go into here, you can see that I've got the button was pressed. All right, so now I need to connect. When I have that button pressed, I want to load the other view controller. So first thing I'll need to do is I'll need to import that particular view controller that we made, the Success View Controller. Go down to where our button code has been created. And so now I'll do an allocate init of this. So I've got my Success View Controller. And we'll make the Success View Controller, we'll alloc or init it with a nib. And the nib, of course, is called Success View Controller. And I'll auto-release it. Okay, once we have that controller, now I'm just going to call self, and we'll do this as a modal view. So I'll do self present modal view controller, passing in the controller, and I want it to be animated. Not a lot of code, but I did have to jump into the code and add some things. And of course, as I mentioned, we're not really seeing the connection here. I've got a nib over here with a button, and I've got another nib over here with the success message. Let's run it and see if it works. Click on Push Me, and up comes the success message. Not sure if that was completely visible with the performance issues I'm having here in California. But anyway, that was two screens that were connected up. Again, not terrible, right? That was still easy to do. And but let's now look at the difference when I do this through our new Xcode. So I'm going to quit this version of Xcode, start up my other. Let's create a new project. Again, I want to have sort of comparing apples to apples, so I'm going to start with a single view application. Call this new button test. All right, so now here's my main storyboard. And I've got the same screen, so we're going to do pretty much exactly what we did with the last one. I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to change the color. And so let's change this to cayenne. Let's move this over. Now, you'll notice down on the lower right, I'm hoping that you're able to see this, that there are some zoom in and zoom out. This becomes really important depending on your real estate. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can get some more real estate here. Move this over. And now I'll just go down to my objects and find yet another view controller and just drop that in. And now I've got my view controller. Whenever I want to actually work on this, you're typically then going to need to zoom back in. So I can click on it, and now I get some different options. If you're zoomed out too far, it won't give you all the options you expect. Here, I'll go in and change the color for this. Let's do what we did before and add the label of success. Just so we know that I'm not cheating, I'll put success number 2. And I'll move over here and we'll add that button. Push me number 2. Okay, so far, the only difference that we've really seen in terms of being able to do this with our old Xcode versus our new Xcode is that I'm now able to see all of my different scenes all in one place. I don't have separate nib files. So if I close some of this up, you can see we've got everything here. The question now is, how do I connect these two? Before, with the old Xcode, I needed to go in and I needed to add a little bit of code. Well, now all I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the Control key and I'm going to drag it. Oops, I can do that again. Control key and drag it over here. And I've created a segue. Let's click on the segue. Let's see what kind of things we can do with the segue. Here I can decide what kind of style I want, whether it's going to be modal, push, or even a custom. And we have our different transitions. I can do a flip horizontal, whatever kind of transition I want. Let's run this. Click push me 2, and there we have our success. So those are the 2 quick benefits that we have. One, we're able to see all of our segues, transitions and whatnot, all in one screen. And you'll notice that, at least so far, I haven't done any coding. All this was automatically created for me. So, and that's something that I found so far with my work with iOS 5, is that, of course, we're going to have to go and code. And, hey, we're all developers. We like coding. That's not the end of the world, right? But, there's some repetitious type things that we do that we no longer have to do. Some of the easy stuff that we would expect to just work does, in fact, just work. All right, let's jump back to the presentation. All right, again, just due to time, I'm just going to go a little bit faster through some of these. We have ways that we can connect to the controller that we're about to send some information to. And the way that we can do that is with a method called prepare for segue. And from this, you'll notice that we have a segue parameter. It's a UI storyboard segue. And we can grab that to get a hold of whatever view controller we're going to. So here I can say segue, give me the controller I'm about to go to. And now I can pass data. I can set properties. It's just a nice way to do that before the transition happens. You can also have multiple segues, which, makes sense, depending on what kind of table cell I click. Maybe I want to go to a different scene. It's able to do that. We can go the opposite direction where maybe we've got 2 scenes that are going to go to one. And if I want to find out which path I'm about to take, when you click on the segue, you'll find that in the attributes inspector, I can give it a name. So in this case, I clicked on the segue you see at the lower left. I went up to the attributes inspector and gave it a name. And now in my code for prepare for segue, what I'm able to do is say, okay, which identifier are we going to? And so for on one segue, maybe I want to, do the work that you see in the if statement. If I'm going to another segue, maybe I want to do something else. So that we can easily figure out what's the path that we're taking from or to our different screens, our different scenes. Another thing that's really nice is that tables now have the ability to be created statically right in Interface Builder. So think about when you had a table view before, and the difficulty it would be to create a custom cell, and then maybe, let's say you just had 4 specific cells that you wanted to have, and they were static. You just didn't really have that ability to make that happen. Instead, what you would do is you would design your cell in its own nib file. You would go into your table view controller, which was probably acting as your table view delegate and data source objects as well. And you'd go in and you'd pretty much hard code the static stuff. So let me do a quick demo of that. I'm not going to go through and show you the old way of doing it because I think everyone knows. So let's just make a brand new static table here and I'll show you the difference. I'm going to create a project. I'm going to just start with a single view just to show you a couple of features. So table example. All right, so right now if I look at my storyboard, I'm just going to have a regular view controller. And just to save some time here, I'm just going to get rid of it completely. I'm just going to get rid of the view controller, just deleting it. Nothing's there right now. Of course, get rid of these classes. I don't need them either. Delete those. All right, so I could have just started with a blank slate too. I just want to show you how easy it is to get rid of this stuff. So now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to grab a table view. And I'm going to drag the table view controller right onto the storyboard. All right. Now normally what would you have had to do? If you had done what I just did and you got rid of whatever was connected as the first view that you were going to see, the first controller, you would have had a lot of issues, right? You would have had to go back in and reconnect up with the new view controller to be the source for the app delegate as the root view controller and all that kind of stuff. Fix up all of your IB outlets that were automatically created. I didn't have to do that. I deleted it. I added a brand new one, and you can see by this arrow that I know this is now the first view and view controller that will be called. So with cells, you'll see that if I click on the table view here, that I get a choice of the content, whether I want it to be a prototype cell or a static cell. So prototypes mean that I can design a cell just like you would in a nib if I was going to create my own UI table view cell, create it in any way that I want, give it a name, and now I can, in the code, reference it there. So what's nice is we can design our cells that we're going to use, reuse the cell just like we've been doing in the past, but it's all in one place now. But for this example, I'm going to create static cells. So now we have static cells, and you can see it starts with 3 rows. I'm going to change that by clicking on the table view section, and it'll give me an option for rows. So here I'm going to just create 4 rows. Let's put a header and footer just to see what that looks like. So my header and my footer. Okay. You can do the same things with sections as well too. So now let's actually start to design these cells. I'll just go into here and drag in some labels. So let's just make it a little different than your normal stuff. Put this as the name. So what I'll do here is I'm going to just list members of a band. So this is going to be the name of the person. And let's change that size to be a little bit bigger. Of course, it's not going to be bigger until I stretch this out and show that it is, in fact, bigger. Center that. And realign. Oh, it's good enough for now. Grab another label, drag and drop that right here. Okay, and that's what we'll have as the name of the instrument. Change that, and let's change the color to be something else. Okay, so that's statically added. If I run this, I'm literally going to see the name and the label. So in fact, I could have different cells here. I'm just going to drag some labels just to sort of illustrate this point, putting them in different places. Of course, we could have names. All right, and I'm just going to run this. And there you have it. So I was able to create a whole bunch of different cells. Of course, this is crazy looking and it doesn't make any sense, but I think you get the idea that normally what I would have had to have done is created 4 different types of cells. I would have had, each of them would have been in their own nib file. I would have needed to have gone into the table view controller, looking at the data source methods and making sure I grab and instantiate the right kind of cell. So when you have static data, we no longer have to do this. You just design right into the storyboard. And so I think that's pretty spectacular. Again, just in the interest of time here, it's already 9:50 my time, 11:50 Central. We have the ability to make just a type of a cell. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to change this. I'm going to get rid of this all this stuff I just made. Just get rid of these. Oops. Clean up a little bit. All right, so in my table view, I'm going to change the content now to be dynamic prototype. And so, again, it's the same idea, but now we're just saying, like, we want to reuse this cell. So, I would drag and drop my stuff in the way that I want it to be set. I'm not just limited to that. I could put in, an image view if I wanted as well, or a UI image and things like that. So you can drag and design this any way you want. What you want to do next is that we want to give this cell a reuse identifier. So my cell. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and what I'm going to do is create a new file. We'll make it a table view controller. Oops. My table view controller. I don't need a nib, so let's get rid of that. Create it. All right, so I've got this My Table View controller, and just as I could before with My Table View controller, I can go through here and say what class it is that I want it to be connected to My Table View. So that's going to, of course, become my delegate and data source. Now here's the difference. If I go into My Table View controller and I go down to the method where we would normally have our cell here that's being created, cell for row at index path. Well, now what I can do is say, here's the cell that I want, whatever we called it, my cell. And what we can get rid of is this code right here. So before, what you would do is you would have to, you'd give a cell identifier, and then you'd look in the queue, and you'd say, hey, if there's already a cell that's been created, let's use that one. And so then we would be able to pop it off, and if one wasn't there, we'd create a new one. Well, now Storyboard, the way that things work, we get to just get rid of that whole logic altogether. And so the only thing we really need now is just simply to queue it with the proper name. And if it's not there, it will instantiate one for us. All right, so that's enough on nibs. Let's try to get through the rest of this material. Let's talk a little bit about automatic reference counting, ARC. So, of course, when I talk to people and they start telling me about, I'd love to make applications for the iPhone and iPad, but, I remember when I had to learn C++, we had to deal with pointers, and, it was just such a nightmare. I don't want to deal with that. So that was actually a big hurdle for people to overcome. And so, the issues with dealing with memory management manually, at least semi-manually as we do in Objective-C, is that if you don't release an object when it should be released, and in fact when it can be released, then you have a memory leak. You have something that's occupying space on the heap, and there's no way to access it to use it, and there's no way to get rid of it. So we start to have memory leaks, and if enough of that happens, your application runs out of memory. And of course, there's also the opposite, where we have dangling pointers. So I have two objects that are pointing to the same object in the heap, and one decides that they're done with it, so they deallocate it. Okay, well, in that case, now you've got a dangling pointer. So these are things that people just didn't want to deal with. And the memory management was, somewhere in between some of that stuff, that they created a retain and release system that we're all familiar with. Well, with ARC, which is included in the low-level virtual machine, also known as LLVM, shipped with the LLVM 3.0 compiler, and ARC simply means this: most of the memory management issues are now handled by the compiler. What does that mean? That means you're no longer going to be calling retain, release, or auto-release. You're not going to have to worry about all those, special method names that we'd be looking for, such as alloc, new, copy, and then deciding whether or not that you want to release it, when should you auto-release it, and all that kind of stuff. And so also, in addition, no longer strictly necessary, at least for memory management. Now, if you have created connection to any resources at all, that's fine. You can go in and create a dealloc and clean up those resources. But two things you shouldn't be doing anymore is you shouldn't be doing any releases at all in your dealloc. You shouldn't be calling soup dealloc. So that's just a little bit less code here. That's all it really is. Now, there's no new binary that's being produced. There's no new engine that's inside of our devices that are able to handle things. There's no garbage collector. It's really the same code. But what's happening now is that it's just analyzing your code. I'm sure many of you have been using Clang, and so you've clicked on Analyze and found that it was able to find some memory issues. It's using that same kind of idea. I guess it's just been improved. Performance has been improved. Its stability has been improved. And what it does is it analyzes your code, and instead of telling you about problems, it goes in and puts in the retains and the releases and the auto-releases and the dealloc methods for you. So it's still there, and that provides us backwards compatibility. The only issue is we don't have to write it. So if we don't have to write it, that's less code, and less code means less bugs. So what do you have to do now as a developer? Do we just forget about everything? Not quite. There's a couple things that you have to do, and that one of the things is with our lifetime qualifiers. I'm going to focus on the topic of properties here, but you can also find that a lot of these lifetime qualifiers exist for instance variables and, for local variables and methods as well. But, for example, when we were creating a property, you're probably familiar with, you set something to be non-atomic, and then you choose either retain, copy, or assign. So now instead of thinking in terms of retain and assign, what you're going to think of are in terms of strong and weak. So a strong reference means that if I'm an object and I'm on the heap and I have a strong reference, that's one or more strong references, I won't be deallocated. If all I have left are weak references, then I will be deallocated. So that's the difference between strong and weak. So if you were writing property retain, what you're going to write now is property strong. If you were writing property assign, now what you'll write is property weak. So you can use weak as well to help deal with cyclic references. I'm going to just bypass the demo that shows that, but if you're familiar with the delegate pattern, that's a common scenario where you'll have two objects pointing to each other, and because of that, it's never released, even though you're not using the first object that's pointing to the other object, which is pointing back to it. So you have this cyclic reference. So you can use weak to help deal with those issues. And if you were using copy, in those places you do continue to use copy because that is exactly the same thing as strong. So again, retain becomes strong, assign becomes weak, copy remains copy. Another thing that's going to be changed is that we have our NS auto release pool. And so this is what you were normally seeing. If you were to go inside your main method, you see we create the NS auto release pool through an alloc and through an init. And once the program's done, it does a release of that pool. Now it uses an instruction for Objective-C as a block. So we've got this @auto release pool. And so this is a block that will replace what we just saw on the previous screen. You are no longer going to be calling alloc and init inside of your release pool for release pools. So that's what we're going to do as developers. How do we enable it? Well, if you're in a brand new project, it's going to be enabled automatically. And in fact, if you look at the project settings and scroll down to where it's the Apple LLVM compiler, you'll see that there is, in fact, an entry called Objective-C automatic reference counting set to yes. You do have the ability to mix and match. This is a question I get frequently, like, okay, but what if I have some files that haven't been cleaned up yet? Is it going to choke? And the answer is yes, it will, unless you go in and explicitly say, I don't want you to handle this in an ARC sort of way. So what you can do is you go into your targets for your Xcode, for your project and click on Build Phases. And when you go to Build Phases, one of the drop-downs there is a Compile Sources. And from Compile Sources, you add a compiler flag, which will tell it, don't use ARC for this file. So you can go in and pick and choose and decide which of your files won't use ARC. And the way that you do that is the compiler setting is fno, minus fno, minus Object-C, minus ARC. How do you migrate? There's no migration for command line applications. At least I haven't been able to see any migration. But with our iOS applications, you will find that when you open it up in Xcode 5, you will see a refactor menu. And the refactor menu has Convert to Objective-C ARC. Now you're going to want to try to clean things up as much as you can, because as soon as you run this ARC tool, if it runs into problems, you're going to have your application in an inconsistent state. And so you want to be careful about that. I mean, you can fix anything, but now you're going to have to go in and to the code and try to figure out where all the problems are. So ARC will do just that. That migration tool will analyze your code, and it'll inform you of problems that you have to fix manually. So you'll get the instructions of where the problems are. And you just follow the rules that I mentioned. Once you've done that, you can run the tool again until all the manual problems are fixed. So I'm going to show you a quick demo here of where I'll take a project and we'll convert it. All right, let's open up my ARC conversion demo. And I'm just going to point out a couple of quick things here. If I look inside of the header file, my implementation file for the app delegate, we've got a couple of ID outlets that have been set with retain, which of course means there's probably going to be a dealloc method, and there is, where we have release. If I look inside of my root view controller, I've got another property that's of type assign. So the retains I would expect to turn into strong. The assigns I would expect to turn into weak. And of course, I've got things like my main method, which have an old style of the auto-release pool with the alloc in it and release. So let's run this. Let's click on the project. I'm going to click on Edit and Refactor. And there you have it, Convert to Objective-C ARC. All right, so I'm going to select the target that I want to convert. It's going to check it. All right, so it gives me a nice warning. We're going to make some changes. I'm just going to let it do its snapshot, although I'll tell you, I haven't had a lot of great luck with the snapshot. In fact, you'll see it right here. So here is supposed to be the two different files, but in fact, when I look at it, here's my two interfaces. You can see that it's just showing me the exact same thing. So I'm just going to accept the changes, and we'll walk through what's happened. So click on main.m. You can see that the auto-release pool has now been changed to the appropriate type of auto-release they're expecting. Go into my interface for the app delegate. All those retains have been changed into strong. And my dealloc method, gone. Where'd it go? There's no dealloc method, right? So we're not going to have a dealloc. If we did have a dealloc to clean up some resources that we've connected to, some streams, that's okay, but we're not going to be using it to release, so it got rid of it entirely. And this one, it didn't change the assign. So this is the kind of stuff that you're going to want to look for. So I would go in here and change this to be weak. And of course, it's giving me a problem, and I will look at that a little bit later. But those are the kind of things that you're going to want to do with ARC. All right, final topic that we'll hit here, and again, I want to thank everyone that's continued to stay online with me, is on iCloud persistence. And as I mentioned at the start of the meeting, hopefully you were able to hear that. That wasn't during the choppy part. But I did mention that iCloud persistence is frankly not a trivial topic. You have to learn several different APIs to really get a good handle of best practices, at least from the perspective of doing this as a developer programmatically. But there really are two primary use cases for iCloud persistence. One sort of has nothing to do with us, at least in terms of who initiates it, and that's when the user decides, rather than syncing to iTunes, I'm going to sync to the cloud. They go into their settings on their device and they say, yeah, let's use iCloud to sync. And with that particular use case, you just want to have some few considerations, kind of not really too much different than what you should have been doing before. And that's just know that anything that you've been storing in the documents directory on the device for your particular application will be backed up. So, they have a finite amount of space with the cloud. So does the device, so that's something you should have been thinking about all along. But, definitely think about it and ask yourself, do I really need to store this information? Could it be retrieved from some other place? So you have to decide what you're going to really put in that documents directory. So that's the first case. But the second case is what you're probably more interested in, and that's, how do I take my data that I want to persist, and I want to put it in the cloud so that if they have other devices, I can share that data amongst them. So you can imagine that I've got some sort of a preference that's been created or some sort of a setting, and I want now that to show up when they go to their other device. So to do that, there's a couple of things that we could do for persisting. There's persisting key value data. There's persisting document storage. And then there's also a third, of course, persisting where we want to persist core data type information. So for time issues here, what I'm just going to do is talk a little bit more about key value, and I'll give you a little explanation about the document setting, and I'll show you a code example for key value. So key value storage is kind of like a plist file on your device, so you're going to have the same restrictions of what you can put in key value storage. So, for example, you can't have any custom objects that you haven't serialized into NS data, for example. And the types of things you can store are NS string, NS date, NS number, and NS data. And, of course, any kind of collection like array or dictionary that stores those types above. So once we've decided what it is we're going to store, we need to keep in mind that it needs to be a small amount of data. They have only 64 kilobytes amount of space for the data for your application. Now, if it's just going to be key value pairs, you really shouldn't have to go bigger than that, but keep that in mind, that there is a limitation. So if I want to store or retrieve simple key pairs, what I'm going to use is a class called NS Ubiquitous Key Value Store. And what's going to happen is, from a developer perspective, I'm just going to say, here, this is the key, here's the value, have at it. And what happens is at first, whatever you put in there is going to be stored in memory. Then at some point, it's going to be stored on disk. And at some other point, it's going to be synchronized with the cloud. So we don't have a whole lot of control over that. There is a synchronized method we have. And what it will do is it will synchronize whatever is in memory and put it to the disk. And once it's in the disk, it will, periodically update and sync with the cloud. But the more that you call synchronize, the longer it will actually wait to synchronize with the cloud. Because what the assumption is, hey, you're making a lot of changes. I'm going to let you just get through making all these changes, and then I'm going to synchronize with the cloud. So it decides when to do that for you. It's periodic. Happens at various intervals. You can register for notifications on the devices so that you can find out when things did change. And so the notification you want to register for is, of course, these wonderful long names. NS Ubiquitous Key Value Store did change externally notification. All right. So that's the name. And you can find out from this particular notification that there are 3 reasons that a change have happened. So we've got a store server change, which means one device somewhere made a change, it's been pushed to the cloud, and so now I want to tell all the other devices that this change has happened. There's an initial sync change, which is letting you know that something has changed from the last time that you stored something when you're trying to write it to the disk. And then there's a store quota violation change. So if something's happened where they've gone above that 64 kilobytes, your application can actually be informed of that as an issue. Documents, on the other hand, and I'll tell you, the key value is pretty easy. I'll show you a couple of examples of that before we're done here. Document is much more intense, much more less intuitive, and you're really going to have to learn several different APIs to go down this path. There's, for example, if I want to check to see if iCloud storage is even enabled, and then, of course, that's something you're going to have to do. We don't want to write an app and assume, hey, you're using iCloud, because if they turn that off, our apps will break. So you need to write conditional logic that's going to decide, am I going to be using iCloud? And the way that you do that for what I showed you with key value is you simply call synchronize. Synchronize, if that returns a Boolean of yes, you're ready to go. If it doesn't, then you need to maybe put it in user preferences or somewhere else, a plist file. So with documents, you actually use on the NS File Manager a URL for Ubiquity Container Identifier. And you pass in your bundle name for your application and your team ID. Now, the team ID isn't what you might expect. In order to actually find the team ID, you need to log into, there's a couple ways to do it, but the easiest I found is to go into your Apple account. If you go to Member Center and look at your account, you should find what that ID is, and it'll be, a bunch of characters. So it's like a unique ID rather than, the name Intertech or something. So if you call this and it returns nil, the iCloud is disabled. If I want to retrieve documents, then I'm going to use something called an NS metadata query. So you want to investigate that particular object of how you can perform a search, and if the search actually grabs something, then that object becomes the container for the result, which you can pull out. If I'm going to do any kind of storage, then I would use NS File Manager set ubiquitous item at URL, destination URL, and error method. So files, at this point, you're going to need to learn about file presenters, for example, and file configuration. And so there's all of these different objects of how you manage your files. There's a great document at the Apple website, developer website, on document handling. So at the end of this presentation, there's some links. Once you download it, you'll see them. It'll bring you to the iOS overview of stuff that's new at Apple. And in the section of iCloud, they will link to this document. What you want to do is really learn about how do you handle documents inside of iOS. So the bottom line is this, that if you don't know how to handle documents inside of a regular iOS device, you're not going to be able to handle documents by persisting them to the cloud. You have to learn the first to do the second. And so you'll find that you need to use, like, for example, an NS File Presenter object to manage things. And one way that you can do that, and probably the easiest way, is to create your own document object that extends UI document. And those documents that I mentioned do talk about that. And, of course, we've got to make sure that our people, the users, have iCloud on. So if you're ever looking to find out how to do that, you just go into your settings, and there's a section for iCloud and documents and data, and you just want to make sure that that's enabled, and that will let you do the persistence on the device. One other thing that you're going to have to know, so once you've gotten all the code down, you figured out, okay, this is how I do all the coding, you're going to need to create an entitlement. If you don't have an entitlement inside of your app, which is yet another certificate that we have to have when we're signing and bundling our apps, you need to create one. And the way that you do that is you go into your provisional profile, your provisional portal, and you create, your brand new app ID, whatever it's going to be. And once you see it in the list, you're going to want to click on the edit, the configure, and you'll notice that when you look at what was created for you as an app ID, that there's a checkbox for enable for iCloud. Right? That part's pretty easy. So you click that, and then you download it, then you create an actual provisional profile based on the app ID that you made that has iCloud enabled. You download it, you double click on it, and it's now available to your applications. And by that I mean when you go and you start a new project, you click on the target, you make sure you're in the summary tab, and down below you'll see an entitlement. And if you simply click enable entitlements, and your app ID match for this project matches the app ID that you created in the provisional portal, it will autofill all the stuff that you need. And then it will create an entitlements file for you. So I'm just going to quickly show you some code here, and this will be our last demo. And thank you very much for sticking with me for an extra 15, 20 minutes here. So I'm first going to click on my iCloud example here, and when I click on the summary, I'll go down. You'll see that I've got these entitlements right down here at the bottom. So there's my entitlement, and it created a file for me that you'll see right over here, iCloud entitlements, which is a plist type file with all the information that you need inside of there. And so that's going to allow me now to sign things and do these key value type storage. So what I'm going to do is now look at just a couple of methods. So here's my view did load. And all that I'm trying to do right now is I've created an app that, in fact, let me run it. This is a limitation of Simulator. That Simulator will, I'll show you the screen, but it will not connect to the cloud. So I can't actually get real data. But this is what I wanted to see, was that I would have one screen here where I could actually create a key and a value. So a key and a value, and I'd click Store in the Cloud. And now I could click on another tab, and I could put a key, and it would print something out. And it actually worked. No, and you know what? It's not getting it from the cloud, to be clear. So just as I mentioned that, you know, things get stored in memory first and then on disk and then synced with the cloud. So that was grabbing it right from the memory. So that's all I'm going to have as far as this app here. Let's look at how we start things off. In my view did load, I'm using that NS ubiquitous key value store to get a handle to the default store. And then I'm registering myself to listen for notifications. So with this notification center, I'm listening for, hey, something changed. And those were those notifications I mentioned earlier. So I know I'm going a little bit fast through this section, but please do download the slides and you can check out how all the finer details. For right now, just get a feel for the general process. And with then I call iCloud synchronized. Now, if I was doing some more careful programming here, I'd want to make sure that the synchronize works so I could decide where I'm actually going to persist these types of things. So the iCloud synchronize, you know, that will also tell me that we're connecting to the cloud. All right, so what down here is that I said, look, if something happens, if I get a notification, I want you to call iCloud data changed. So here's what it is. The iCloud data change, it gets a notification. I get a handle to that default store again. And what I have here with this iCloud dictionary representation is that it's saying I got stuff from the cloud, and here's all the different, here's a dictionary of all the keys and values that I was able to get. And so down here, I'm just kind of iterating through and printing out as a log message, here are all the different keys and values that we have. And you can see in the lower right corner that it only found one. That's one other reason how I know that it didn't go to the cloud, because I've been working on this demo for, you know, over a month and as part of the presentation, and there's lots and lots of keys that have been set. All right, so that's how I get notified that a key is changed from some other device. Now I can update, you know, a second or a third or a fourth device. But how do I actually send stuff? Well, this is really easy. I grab that ubiquitous key value store's default store, and they have a method. They've got set string. They've got, you know, lots of different set methods. And so here I've got the value that I'm going to be setting for a given key. And in this case, I'm just grabbing what the user had entered. And I select synchronize. Now, you'll see some comments in the official documentation that says, for the most part, you don't really have to synchronize a lot. That's going to happen when your app goes into the background. There's other triggers that you don't have to worry about that will cause a synchronize. And in fact, calling synchronize too often, as I mentioned, might be detrimental to your application in terms of how frequently it will synchronize with the cloud. So I don't necessarily need synchronize here. You'll get a feel, I guess, over time of when to call it and when not to call it. And that's it. Now it's been put in memory. Once I call synchronize, it gets written to the disk. And once it's been written to the disk, at some point later, it will be synchronized with the cloud. That part, that's pretty easy. The key value stuff is pretty easy. Documents, unfortunately, not a trivial matter at all. Not a trivial matter. So if you're in town in Minnesota, love to encourage you to join me at TCI Dev, where I spend an entire hour talking just on that subject. Of course, I'm going to share that same information with Intertech, And so if you go to intertech.com/blogs, you'll find at that point, some point in the very near future, that I'll be writing several articles that go into detail about using documents and eventually core data with the iCloud. So that's about it for the presentation. A couple of other features I want to mention. There's some new frameworks for single sign-on, Twitter integration. The simulator now allows you to specify locations. So if you want to test different locations using core location. Some more customization for UI kit controls, and we've got some great things in Interface Builder. You can now drag and drop gesture recognizers. There's that brand new page view controller as well. Play around with that. That one is a little bit of fun. And of course, we have our resources. So again, please download this. You'll be able to find it, I believe, at least a link for it on our Facebook page eventually here. But of course, we've got lots of resources for you. Intertech.com/blog, where we're blogging about everything from iOS development to Java to .NET. We have a Twitter account, twitter.intertech.com, Facebook, facebook.intertech.com, LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. So what did we learn today? We learned that hotels are not necessarily the best place to conduct a seminar with Wi-Fi going in and out. We looked at introducing iOS 5 SDK. We talked about storyboards in some detail. Again, that's my favorite new feature of iOS 5. I'm absolutely loving creating interfaces with it. We have automatic reference counting, so we no longer need to worry so much about those retain and releases and dealloc methods. And I showed you a quick way that you can go in and do a conversion. And of course, a short overview on persisting app data with the iCloud, just to give you a feel of where it's simple, where it's complex, and hopefully give you an idea of some resources of how you can learn to use the technology. First of all, is it possible to convert an existing project to make use of storyboards? Now, I'll tell you, that's something that I've been playing around with quite a bit. And the answer, of course, is officially yes, you can. You can add a new storyboard to a project. And you can change, as I've shown you in the target, where you say, instead of loading everything from the main window nib, let's now load from the storyboard. With that said, I haven't had a great and easy path that I've been able to abstract that says, now let's take our nibs and drop them all into the storyboard. So far it's been kind of a manual process for me, and I don't want to say that that's the only way it can be done, but given the the iOS 5, which is officially released just a couple weeks ago, I think I need a little bit more time to play with it to see if there are any best practices for migrating. And you can be sure that as soon as I figure out what those best practices are, I will be posting that on our blog at intertech.com/blog. Second question then was, how can I download Xcode 5? The App Store only has 4.2. We're finally hitting this point now where the version of iOS is, it's not corresponding with the version of Xcode anymore. So in fact, Xcode 4.2 is the version of Xcode that you would use for iOS 5. So when you download Xcode 4.2, you're going to get the iOS 5 SDK. That's exactly the one you want. What you don't want is the older version like Xcode 4.0 something, or of course any of the 3 versions. So those are the questions I see.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. Thank you again to everyone that joined us this afternoon, and have a great day.